Okay, so I'm just going to go over real quick. Last week, we sort of introduced what are called logical arguments. So I want to, again, write on the board sort of an example of what I mean by that. So if you remember from last week, I wrote this argument that said all animals with wings can fly. Number two, pigs have wings. Number three, pig is an animal. And then the conclusion is, therefore, pigs can fly. And the reason I'm putting this up here is because obviously you're like, well, that is dumb. But what I want to show is that this argument is what is called logically valid. And what it means is the conclusion follows from the premises. So when you're looking at an argument, the first thing you want to assume is that every premise is true, and then therefore the conclusion follows. That's the first thing you ask. Now I could say, if the conclusion was something like, therefore, God exists, I could say, you guys can all go home. I think I proved my point. Now, when you look at this argument, you could say, well, wait, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, so it's not even a valid argument. So we don't even need to discuss it anymore. So when it's a valid argument, the next question we ask is it a good argument? And when we're asking that, we have to look at the premises, and we want to examine the truth of the premises. And clearly, 1 and 2 are false, so therefore this is not a good argument. Now, the other thing we have to take in consideration, though, is that you can have an argument that has true premises, but it still isn't a good argument because we don't actually know the truth of the premises. So, I mean, I wasn't really going to formulate an argument, but we can say, let me just think of one. If Napoleon steps in a puddle, his boot gets wet. Now, please forgive me because I don't know the dates of when Napoleon was alive. So let's just say on April 4th. Does anybody know when Napoleon was around? Yeah. Yeah, we'll say like 1821, Napoleon stepped in a puddle. And then, therefore, we can conclude that on that date, 1821, Napoleon's boot was wet. Now, again, this is a valid argument, and now this very well all these premises might be true, but we have no idea like that they're true or not. Like, we have no way, they're not plausibly true. We have no way to know. So again, that is not a good argument, even though the premises might be true. So what you also want is true premises, but they also must plausibly be true. Now, the other thing I was sort of thinking of, and you might have questions, is why are we sort of presenting arguments in these numbered forms? Like, this is what's called a logical form. And the reason is because it makes it sort of easier to discuss and explain. Rather than me standing up here and give this long lecture, we have these basically bullet points that we can look to. And it's like when you're talking to someone maybe about this stuff, you don't have to be like, well, you know, premise 1 says, premise 2 says. This is more for a class setting that makes it very easy to discuss. Okay, so that if you sort of, the people who weren't here last week sort of understand what a valid argument is and a good argument. Looking at a couple people who weren't here. Okay, so we talked about this argument last week, and it's the argument from contingency. It's from Gottfried Leibniz, and what Leibniz basically asked was, why is there something rather than nothing? And that's sort of what I want people to really remember. Remember that question, why is there something rather than nothing? So the argument was formulated by Dr. Craig, And basically it goes like this. 1, every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. So I want to focus on that one first. And what they're talking about is 2 types of existence. The first is it's something that exists necessarily. And what this means is that it is impossible for it not to exist. And I use the example of numbers, like the number 1, if it exists necessarily. So it's basically if the number 1 exists, and that's up for debate. I don't necessarily think that it actually exists, but if it does, it's impossible for the number 1 to not exist or to be something else. You might call it 2, but it still is the number 1. Roman numeral 1, the number 1, uno, they're all representations of the number 1. And that was for you, Halima. As Dave pointed out last week, you get real thirsty up here. Now, the other type of existence is something that is what is called contingent. And something that exists contingently is something that is dependent upon something else. And this is sort of easy, like think of anything, think of yourself, think of this table, think of these pieces of paper. They have some explanation outside of themselves that explains their existence. And again, I think the majority of things exist in this way. I actually think the only thing that exists necessarily is God, if God does exist. I don't think numbers actually exist. Sometimes some philosophers think like the content of a truth statement, like not actually the statement, but what the content is. Like, for example, let's say like snow is white, said in any language, it's the content. They think that sort of exists necessarily. Again, philosophers are weird. So I want to hand out another handout that sort of not explains, but I wrote it down. If you don't want, just pass it back. The difference between contingency and necessity. If you look up dependent in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it actually says contingent on. So they're sort of interchangeable words. And sorry, I lost my thought, but you'll hand that out. Now, this is key to this argument. Does everybody understand the difference between necessary and contingent? I mean, I know last week a couple people were sort of having trouble with necessary. And so oftentimes I'm going to use God just because I think he's the easiest thing to talk about when talking about necessary, is that they'll say God is like self-existent. Like God exists because he is God. There's nothing that could have caused God, because if something caused God, that then would be greater than God, and that would be God. So when you're reading premise 1, it's not saying that God doesn't have an explanation. Like he says, every existing thing has an explanation, so that even God is included in here. So God would have an explanation, and that explanation is basically in that he is God. I know that sort of sounds like you're being circular, but most philosophers agree on this. Now, the second premise, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. I'm going to skip over talking about this for right now. Let's go to premise 3. The universe is an existing thing. Now, I want you to look at premise 1 and 3. The beginning of premise 1, every existing thing has an explanation of its existence. So what we're saying is, if you look at premise 3 is an existing thing. So therefore, premise 3, the universe must have an explanation of its existence. Now, let's look at the 2 types of existence, contingent or necessary. Now, most people don't think that the universe exists necessarily. Mostly because when you think about what the universe is, basically all of the physical world, it's just a collection of all these things. The universe is a collection of planets, galaxies, space, time, and each one of these things seems to exist contingently. So that is why we sort of avoid thinking of the universe as being necessary. I hope that sort of makes sense. Now, taking these three premises together, we can conclude that the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. Now, last week, number 2 seemed to be the big one, and rightly so. It's sort of, the question arose, why is God basically given as the explanation without any sort of definition of God? Now, when we talk about the universe in this argument, we can define the universe, as I said before, as it's all of space. All of physical space is the universe. All of time, all of matter, all of energy, all of physical reality. So when you think about what would explain the universe, it has to be something that is sufficient to explain all of existence. And so what could explain the universe? It would have to be spaceless, had to be timeless, it would have to be not made up of matter and energy, and it would have to be something that has enough explanatory power to explain all of existence. So on the sheet of paper, I gave a sort of a definition for God for this, that God is necessary, he is spaceless, timeless, personal, transcendent, and has great explanatory power. Now, why did I put personal in there? Philosophers will often talk about two types of things that are spaceless and timeless. One is called abstract objects, and abstract objects are like numbers. They are these things that they think exist, but they have no sort of form. They're not in space, they're not in time. Like these sort of necessary truths of mathematics are called abstract objects. Problem with abstract objects is they have no causal power, they have no explanatory power. Like the number 7 can't explain anything. The other thing that philosophers will think that is spaceless, timeless, and not made up of matter and energy is a mind. Now, some people would argue that, well, a mind is, all these physical neurons going off in your brain. And I would say maybe, but that's just a human mind. Like we can conceive of other types of minds, other types of intelligence. I mean, what's going on now in the computer world is, all this work towards artificial intelligence. I mean, that would be an intelligence that is not made up of the same stuff that's in our mind. So again, I think that gives a good example of a mind that's not just a human brain. And the thing about a mind is a mind does have causal power. It's not like a number. So that's why we call God personal. You have to think that to be the explanation of all of existence, there needs to be some sort of will. So a mind has a will. Now, I said I was going to get into the objections to this argument, so I'm going to start with one objection to premise 2 first, because it's what we're talking about. A common objection is that, okay, the universe has an explanation, but it could be any number of things. Like it doesn't have to be God. And again, that's sort of where I'm going is you ask that person or that objection, like give an example of an explanation that would have the power to explain all of existence. And if you think about maybe some type of mechanical explanation, I don't mean mechanical as a machine, but some sort of thing that doesn't have will, it's, no, not because energy is part of the universe. So Linda asked, energy could cause the universe, but energy is part of the universe. But I'm thinking of some universe creating type of machine that's not a machine, that just isn't personal, and it's necessary that it just creates universes. Now the problem with this is that if it's necessary that it creates universes, then the universes that it creates must also be necessary. They can't then be contingent, because for something to be contingent, it could have not have existed. So for the universe to not have existed, there had to be some sort of choice involved there. So I'm saying so I believe that the creator of the universe had to have some sort of free will. So there had to be a will to create a universe, and that's what makes the universe contingent. Again, it's hard to sort of conceive of something, like I said, this weird universe creating machine that just, it's necessary that it creates universes. Every universe would then be necessary. And again, we looked at that we don't think that the universe is necessary. So does that resolve some of the issues with premise 2 that people might have had? Is there any questions about why we have God in there as the explanation of the universe? I think everyone kind of gets that now. All right. So let's go into some of the bigger problems, not problems, but what typically atheist philosophers use to sort of reject this argument. More recently, this argument has been attacked with what is called the fallacy of composition. And what this is what is true of parts of something doesn't mean that the whole thing shares that trait. So you can think of, an elephant is made up of these tiny parts that aren't heavy, but an elephant is heavy. Think of like a wall of Legos. So you're building a wall, like each block is 1 inch, but when you build the wall isn't 1 inch. So that is what's like been used recently to attack this argument, that they're saying that just because everything in the universe is contingent, it doesn't mean the universe as a whole is contingent. They call it the fallacy of composition. Now, however, a good response to this argument is that I think they're sort of misapplying this fallacy, is because using the same thing as Legos, you can make a Lego wall out of all red Legos, and the whole wall will be red, even though the individuals are red. So the one example is using length, the other is using color. So clearly there's different aspects to different things, and some things apply to the whole and some things don't. Now, if we break that down, you take a Lego that's 1 inch, and then you have another Lego that's 1 inch, and you just put 2 of them together. They're not both 1 inch. So even though something might apply to the whole, in that example, it also applies to each individual thing. So using it in terms of contingency, if I'm contingent and then I take the chair as contingent, if you put us both together, we don't then become both necessary. And I think when you use the inch example with this wall, that's sort of how it applies. I think contingency is more like color. Like it's, if you take groups of things, everything in this room is contingent, and put them all together, they're still all contingent. They still all depend on something else for their existence. And the universe is just a collection of different things. And I don't think of anything like in the universe as being necessary. And just because we put them all together, that it doesn't mean that the unit as a whole then suddenly becomes a necessary thing. So I think that this fallacy of composition is really misapplied here. And like I was just saying, every collection of parts of the universe seems to be contingent. So does everybody sort of understand what the fallacy is trying to point out and how it's misapplied? No, Tommy?
Oh, never mind, I'm just thinking. Sorry.
Okay. Well, you don't shake your head like this. Yes.
So we're contingent. We're all contingent. Everything is contingent.
One sec. We want to actually ask people to use a microphone when they ask a question, if that's okay.
All right, so we're contingent. Everything in this room is contingent. God is necessary.
Yes.
He can exist without anything else. We can't.
Yes.
Okay. And when you put many contingent things together, like the Lego, it doesn't mean that it becomes necessary.
Correct.
It's still contingent.
Yes.
So what I'm missing is, what are the atheists or the people that don't believe in God, what are they saying? Are they saying that it does become necessary if you put contingent things together?
They're not saying that it does become necessary, but they're saying that just because everything in the universe has an explanation doesn't mean that the universe as a whole has an explanation. So that's what's called by the fallacy of composition. You know, they're not saying that like, oh, it then becomes necessary. They're just saying that you're using this fallacy of composition. You know,
Okay.
they're trying to avoid it.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, if you want, you can ask the question and I'll just re-say it.
Yeah, just to clear up my mind, your podium is contingent on a carpenter making it?
Yeah, or it's just, yeah, exactly. Contingency just means like, it's not so much, I said the word cause, but it's not so much that it was caused by something else, but it has an explanation for why it's here. And that's what I said. Everything in the universe, even outside the universe, like I said, God has an explanation, and it's that he is necessary. You know, I'm not trying to avoid like the explanation. You know, we're not saying that God is exempt from this. We're saying he has an explanation. It's that he's a necessary being. Excuse me while I take some more water. It's very necessary that I drink this water. Okay, let me check. Okay, so now the biggest objection to this argument, and this might be hard to fathom, I sort of said this, is that atheists will often object to premise one. What they will actually say is that the universe has no explanation. Bertrand Russell was a famous late 20th century philosopher, and he said that the universe is just there, and that's all. Carl Sagan, as I said last week, he said the cosmos is all there ever was, is, and ever will be. The universe exists inexplicably. The universe has no explanation of its existence. So they're rejecting number one, and number two, but that's how they'll reject the whole argument. Now, just saying that, it sort of seems like that just, doesn't seem intuitive. It seems that everything needs to have an explanation. But how they have a sort of an argument for this, and how they frame it is that they'll define the universe the same way I did. The universe is all of time, all of space, all of matter, all of energy. And so an explanation for the universe has to come outside this. And when I say outside, I don't mean physically outside. It's just an external explanation. But external to the universe is nothing. And they say it's impossible for nothing to explain something. So therefore, it's impossible for the universe to have an explanation. Now, the problem with this, and maybe you'll see the problem with this, is that it assumes that atheism is true. They're assuming that the only thing that exists is the universe. So that outside the universe is nothing. And I do agree that something can't come from nothing. And so what happens is that the atheist is then arguing in a circle. And what I'll do is I'm going to write this out to illustrate. The atheist can rephrase premise two. I wrote this last week. And it'll say, if the universe has no explanation, then atheism is true. Now, the problem with what they're saying is, if the universe has no explanation, how they're justifying it is they're assuming that atheism is true. Saying the universe has no explanation because there's nothing outside the universe. So basically their explanation for this is atheism is true, therefore the universe has no explanation. So as you see, this to get to there, but then it just goes in a circle. It's a circular argument. Now, what they might say is that you're doing the same thing. Theist is doing the exact same thing. You're just using God as an explanation. But we're not. Now, let's look at premise 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. We're not saying God exists to say that the universe has an explanation. We're using premise 1, that we're saying the universe exists and the universe is contingent, and we're saying that all things have an explanation. So a contingent universe still needs an explanation. We're not saying, like if what they claimed is that we're saying the same thing, this would read, if the universe has an explanation, that explanation is God. God exists, therefore the universe has an explanation. And we're not saying that. And so we are not arguing in a circle as they are. And I will say, like I said last week, this is a logically equivalent statement to number 2. Like, I agree with this statement that if the universe has no explanation, atheism is true. And that's the same as number 2. It's what's called like a double negative. You know, they're both the same, have the same truth value. So actually, I think that is it for this argument. Does anybody want to talk more about this argument? Anybody can think of other objections? Does everybody understand the argument now? Oh, wow. I was expecting a lot more questions. I'm like, whew. No, just this argument. Yeah. And everyone sees how the atheistic objection is just arguing in a circle. They're assuming atheism is true. And again, this is current. I went to atheism.wikia.com today and read basically the same thing. They basically say that existence has no explanation because something can't come from nothing. Again, and we're not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying that nothing is impossible. Like there's God.
I have a question based on what you just said. So if something can't come from nothing, but these are things that are around us, then I guess I'm failing to see what is the explanation then for how something got here if it can't come from nothing?
God.
Well, no, but I'm trying to put my mind into that, what you just said from atheism.wikia.com or org. I'm trying to understand that argument.
Oh, it's not an art. They just say that the universe has no explanation. Like existence just is. You know, the universe just is without an explanation.
Okay.
Yeah. It is. There was, I should have wrote down, can't think of his name, but there was an atheist who in a debate in around 2003, I think his last name was Nelson. I mean, he said not only does he not believe in God because of the evidence, he said that he wants atheism to be true. He admitted that. He says he doesn't want to live in a universe where there's a God. And I think that goes to the heart of it. Okay, so before we move on, we'll see where we're at with time. I had a couple other questions from other people sort of concerning Christianity and how this applies to Christianity. It was more like, I believe in God, I'm a Christian, and I've never heard anything like this before. Like, do I need arguments to believe in God? And I want to say, no. Like, these arguments aren't necessary for belief in God at all. There is a Christian philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. I'm not going to write his name down because I don't know how to spell it, but he's alive right now. And he says belief in God is what's called a properly basic belief. And that is a belief that you don't really need an argument for. It's, if you're a child, it's who your dad is because he's there. You have evidence and you don't even think of it as evidence. There's no argument. He believes that belief in God is the same way, that it's a basic belief. And the reason he thinks this is because, and this is what I believe as a Christian, and this is what you should also have faith in if you're a Christian, is that you believe in God because you have a relationship with God. Like God has made himself known to you. Another Christian philosopher, Alistair McGrath, who was an atheist for a very long time, probably into his late 50s, very much like C.S. Lewis, when asked in a debate, said, "Why do you personally believe in God?" And he said, "The same reason I believe in my dad. It's like, because I have a relationship with him." And so as a Christian, like, I would say that you don't need these arguments. So then the question might be, well, like, why? Like, then what's the point? Is it just because you feel good being intellectual talking about this stuff? This makes you feel smarter. And I think there's like a number of reasons. First, I'll give like from my own life is that I started studying this stuff in my early 20s. And as a Christian, you have a faith. And oftentimes, we talk about having a strong faith, not having faith built on sand. And so for me, what these arguments did in studying the philosophy is that it actually strengthened that foundation. Like it sort of just keeps building up. I too, I came to know God in my 20s, and that's how I know he exists. But then studying this stuff also helped cement that. The other thing I want to say is that we live in a world that is increasingly secular, and we live in a pluralist country, and I'm not putting that down. I actually think that's a good thing, and I think that the reason our country is sort of pluralist is because it was founded as a Christian country, and it was founded on the values of freedom. However, though, it becomes increasingly hard to talk about your faith as a country gets more secular. It's like, how do you meet people when they've never even heard anything about Christianity? And so what this can do is it can sort of give you a starting point to talk to people. I think that it's always good to look for common ground. You might think that oh, great, I have these new arguments, I'm going to go prove some people wrong. And if that's your attitude, I would say no. If you notice on your first sheet, I wrote at the very top, we can disagree without being disagreeable. And that's sort of the philosophy of this class. As a Christian and talking to the Christians, we are called to do everything out of love. And sort of making someone look bad or making someone feel inferior intellectually is not what we're called to do. And please don't try to use these in that way. But this can give you a ground. These can help if someone questions you. It's oh, why do you believe in God? It's oh, because I'm a Christian. And they're oh, well, that's just a bunch of voodoo. Then you can say, well, actually, here's why. You can ask the person the question, well, why is there anything? Why does something exist rather than nothing? So hopefully that sort of lets you know where I'm coming from. And if you're sort of wondering how you can use these things, there you go. And if you're not a Christian, let's talk after the meeting.
You said, I can understand how we're now saying and agreeing, and you substantiate that there's God. Because something outside of everything that we know is created, there's got to be something outside of that. We're agreeing with that. But you haven't substantiated that it's the Christian God.
No.
Okay.
No.
So at one point or another, do you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, yes, she's basically asking is this has nothing to do specifically with Christianity, and are we going to maybe get there? And yes. The reason I started with this argument is because I said that question is, I think, one of the most fundamental questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Okay. So moving on, I have a new sheet for everybody. We're going to get into the next argument. So be excited to be more confused. Oh, wait, I need one of those. Thanks. Adam, if you put up number 2. But don't be worried, because this argument is very similar. And a lot of these arguments kind of go hand in hand. They sort of support each other. And if you remember that first argument, I was trying to be very clear that it had to do with explanations. This argument has to do with cause. This is a causal argument. So it's not so much about explanation, it's about what causes something. I have to go into a little bit of explanation, so I'm going to take another drink real quick. So I'm going to get a little wordy. So this argument is called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, Kalam is sort of the Muslim word for like the word, like how we call the Bible the word, the word. They would sort of use Kalam as like for the Quran. It's, you know, big W, the word. And so this argument actually has its origins in Muslim theology. And that's why it's called the Kalam cosmological argument. So a little history is as Christianity started to spread through Greece, I mean all parts of the world, but specifically Greece, the Greeks had a belief in the universe as being eternal. It was the eternal universe that was just always there. Aristotle believed that matter exists forever. Matter was necessary. So the Christian fathers at the time like disagreed with this. You know, they thought, no, God created the universe. God is the cause of the universe. It wasn't always there. So this debate started happening, these causal debates. Like, was the universe always there? Was it created? So in the Middle Ages, as, you know, the Persian Empire sort of swept through and was taking over all this land, some Muslim theologians sort of picked up on this and they liked it. They sort of, because there was the same problem in Islam at the time, is that a lot of the Muslim scholars believed that the universe was always there. And so they picked up on this Christian argument and then they sort of refined it. And one of the scholars at the time who I'm going to be talking about is this guy named Al-Ghazali. And he lived around the 13th century. And sort of, again, Dr. Craig is the one who formulates the arguments, but this argument specifically, he is the modern day expert on this argument. And this argument is the most discussed argument in atheist and Christian philosophy right now. It's in all the texts, like when we're talking about the philosophy of God and God's existence, this is the argument that has the biggest debate going on right now. And it sort of had a resurgence at the beginning of this, in the beginning of the 1900s, with the sort of what is called the Big Bang, the discovery of the origin of the universe. And that also gave credence to this argument, is that, you know, the universe actually had a beginning that science sort of points to. You know, the best science even today points to the universe having a beginning. And so Christian theologians sort of jumped on that. They brought this argument back. And so that's where we are. As I said, this argument is similar to the first, but a little different. So let's just go through the argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning. It's very simple. So you think. So I think right tonight we're just going to discuss premise 1. Premise 2 is where all the fun starts. So premise 1 seems just commonsensical. Whatever begins to exist sort of has a cause. And by begin, we mean like temporal, in time, something that comes into being in time, like has a cause. You can even think of your thoughts. You know, your thoughts sort of have a cause, and thoughts are in time. You know, to sort of reject this premise is sort of, you know, implying that stuff comes into existence out of nothing. You know, like if something doesn't have a cause, like it could just pop into existence, you know. All of a sudden, a person could just pop here, you know, because things that begin to exist don't have causes, so that could just happen. Dr. Craig says, like, this is actually worse than magic if you reject this, because in magic, you have a magician. If you reject this premise, like, there's not even a magician. There's just, things just happen. You don't have Harry Potter with his wand. You just have something happening, you know. And it seems that if this were the case, like if this weren't true, like it would sort of happen a lot more. Like if our universe wasn't a causal universe, like why didn't things just come into existence all the time? Like why does this seem like everything that in our experience has a cause? Now there's another sort of objection to this that you have to sort of take my word because I don't want to get too far into it. It has to do with quantum physics. My dad could come up and, give a, apparently he's doing lectures on quantum physics. I'm just kidding.
Can't even pronounce quantum physics.
So in quantum physics is basically the world of subatomic particles. So when you get smaller than the atom, there's this whole other universe of these particles, these fields of energy. And so in there's things happen that seem to be unpredictable. Things seem to come in and out of existence. These tiny, what they call virtual particles, quarks, behave in ways that we can't predict. So a lot of people will say, well, look, quantum physics disproves this. Now, not so fast. Just because we don't necessarily know the cause doesn't mean that there isn't one. And a lot of it is there's these fields of energy at the subatomic level, and these things that they call virtual particles aren't even actually particles, it's just fluctuations in the energy. And so when energy fluctuates and it hits other fields of energy fluctuating, things happen, and they can't really predict what's going to happen. So then for someone to reject this based on that sort of just seems a little, off the cuff to me. There definitely is a cause for why these things happen. We just can't explain the result yet. So we'll be getting into quantum physics later, so we'll just leave it at that for now. Yeah. My dad's studying up. So on your sheet, I think I just explained that. But yeah, like I said, if something can come into being from nothing without a cause, why doesn't it happen? Why doesn't it happen more? As I said, so to say that the universe doesn't have a cause, it's sort of intuitive to think then that why do more things not have causes? Why don't people just pop into existence? Why don't cars just pop into existence? I want a unicorn. Where's my unicorn? Why doesn't a unicorn just pop into existence? And so this first premise is very intuitive, but again, I wanted to sort of explain that. It's also the purpose of science is to kind of explore the causes of things, why things happen, why things the way they are. And, like I said, a lot of atheists that object to this will latch onto science, and to me, it's sort of dishonest because it's, the whole goal of science is to sort of explain our universe and explain the causes of our universe and what happens in our universe. So it's always been interesting to me to see that they use sort of science and to latch onto science in this way. So does anybody have any questions about the first premise? Any things they would like to say? Again, we're not getting too far ahead into the second premise because, like I said, that's where all the fun starts. So I think I'm going to end it there for now. If anybody has anything they'd like to discuss that aren't necessarily related to these arguments, we'll have 10 more minutes that we could talk about stuff. I guess not. The reason I don't want to go forward is because next time, number 2, the universe began to exist. We're going to be talking about the math of infinities. So that's why I don't want to just jump into that right now. All right, thanks, guys. And one last note, on the bottom of every sheet, I have my name, my phone number, and my email address. And if anybody has any questions about this or about anything, feel free. I'm open to talk about anything, discuss anything. It doesn't have to just be philosophy. It could be, the weather. I was going to say, if you have questions about Christianity or Christian doctrine, but if you want to talk about the weather, it's fine. I'm going to, zone out, but all right. 2 weeks from now. I'll bring up my thing and I'll check the date. Hold on one sec.
Just, I have a comment, is, before I came to know the Lord, you mentioned Bertrand Russell.
Hold on a sec.
It's not a question.
It's fine.
If I get a microphone, I'll start.
So, yeah.
Before I came to the Lord, my dad had passed away, and I was kind of really searching and wondering what life was all about. And I remember I was living up in Shane Dakin and had rented a farmhouse, and there was this whole library of books, and I picked this book by Bertrand Russell. And I read the book, and I was never more depressed in my life. This is before I knew the Lord. I mean, because it just left you so empty. It was really arguing that there is no purpose to life and when you mentioned Bertrand Russell, I remembered that, reading that and how discouraged it was.
On that note,
And the emptiness that this, and I remember when he passed away, and I'm thinking, boy, that this poor man that had.
yeah, and on that note, bringing up him, and then close to his death, before he died, he regretted, and he said the one thing in his life he never experienced was love. Like, all right, you guys have a good night. On that positive note.